Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. I've been to lots of these um, Adventist Today Sabbath schools, and many of you are familiar faces, and of course, just from that, and I feel like I know you from seeing your faces here. And of course, I see a number of people who I've known over the years. Right now, looking at a thumbnail of Pat and Ron Capel, who I knew as members of the AAF board decades ago. I think it was the 1980s, um, and might have been the 70s for all I know. And um, I see um, my friends, the Haywoods from Asheville, who are involved with me in the forum there. It's good to see you all here today. Well, I'm getting over pneumonia, so my voice is not good. So I appreciate your kindness to me in that regard today. Um, I should also say that this is a fairly complex question, and I need to spell it out carefully. And so I think that the most sensible thing to do, what I've done is to cut the paper in half down to the bare bones, but I'm going to read it rather than just try to speak it because I'm going to forget the details if I try to speak it. But you will have, Loren has made an excellent set of slides. I've always had people to do slides with me when I was a teacher, and now that I'm retired, I've got no one who does slides for me, so I can't do them. Anyway, away we go. Church-sponsored injustice, the Adventist Church and polygamous converts. Polygamy has been the most complex, perplexing, and persistent marriage-related problem encountered by churches in their missionary enterprise. The most intense and resistant problems were encountered in Africa, where this form of marriage was most widespread. I will divide my presentation into three segments. The first will clarify the key terms that will be used, and then consider the functions played by polygamy in traditional African societies. The second will explore how the various Christian missions which preceded Adventists to Africa handled polygamous converts. The third will consider how Adventists relate to converts who were already involved in pluralistic marriages and how this has changed over time. So let's come to the terminology. The word polygamy is a general term that refers to a cultural situation where one person has more than one spouse concurrently. There are two more specific terms that fall under the general category. Polygyny is the form of polygamy where one man has multiple wives. Polyandry is the form where one woman has multiple husbands. Polygyny is much more common than polyandry. It is found in many parts of Africa, Asia, and Papua New Guinea. Polyandry is found only in the highlands of the Indian subcontinent and in one small island group in the North Pacific. All the examples of polygamy in the Hebrew scriptures, heroes such as Abraham, Jacob, David, and Solomon, practiced polygyny. And when Paul instructed the early church that an elder had to be the husband of one wife, he seems to have been ruling out polygynous candidates. I will use the term polygamy in this presentation because it's the best known word, and in fact, all cases will be polygynous. Let me continue two other terms, also patrilineal and matrilineal. Excuse me. In a patrilineal society, the male line is key. When a male there marries, the wife's kinship group receives a bride price, and she moves to the husband's community. The children all belong to their father's group. If a wife is divorced, a rare occurrence in such a community, she is cut loose from that community, including her children, and belongs nowhere. Patrilineal societies are by far the most common in Africa, and it is among them that polygamy has flourished. In contrast, it is in matrilineal society, the mother's line is central and is usually emphasizes her uncle. The husband is a fairly insignificant figure, and divorces are much more common. Polygamy is rare there. What functions have been played by polygamy in traditional Adventist African societies? Now take notice of these. These are important to remember. Because polygamy is intrinsic to a traditional society's total way of life, It has the economic, social, political, and religious manifestations. Polygamy is a legal form of marriage, and it flourishes in rural areas. It strengthens the lineage, creates a network of alliances for the kinship group, and secures the labor needed to farm the land. It provides for the needs of women in a society where, because of tribal wars, they heavily outnumber men. And yet it is unthinkable that single women and widows would live alone, where divorce is often not tolerated, since marriages are contracted by groups of kinsmen rather than individuals, where procreation is valued most highly and is the main object of marriage, and the burden of childlessness is heavily felt. The system protects the needy and ensures that no child is illegitimate by allowing for the most privileged men to take the surplus women and establish polygamous families. For example, when a church refuses to allow a member to enter a Levitic marriage with a widow of his brother, a system which was also set up among the Hebrews in Deuteronomy 25, this destroys the social mechanisms which provide for widows and orphans. It was estimated in 1970, soon after the close of the colonial period in Africa, that more than 20% of the families were polygynous in 75% of the African societies, and that there were 150 wives per 100 married males in sub-Saharan Africa. Although economic and social changes, especially those associated with urbanization, have gradually reduced the incidence of the formation of such marriages since then, polygamy remains a central concern to the churches in Africa. How did other Christian missions handle polygamous converts in Africa? Christianity grew up in a monogamous world. The first recorded official Christian statement on polygamy dates to 1201, when the Bishop of Tiberias asked Pope Innocent III if polygamous converts should keep all wives or only one, and if the latter, which one. The Pope insisted on strict monogamy, calling polygamous unions adultery, and refused baptism to any parties to such a marriage. The Catholic Church did not face an extensively polygamous society until missionaries entered Asia and America in the 16th century, and Protestants not until the 19th century, first in parts of Asia and then more widespread in Africa. Both responded negatively to the new situations. However, the policies they imposed proved destructive. When the Anglican Church addressed the issue in West Africa in the middle of the 19th century, the missionaries had little theology of marriage and little understanding of the relativity of social patterns. Anthropologists, for example, had not yet studied marriage. Their concept of Christian marriage was what they had known at home. They regarded much of African life as immoral and condemnable, especially polygamy and bride wealth, and they were almost universally repulsed by the practice. Missionaries often assumed that lust was the real reason for polygamy. Since polygamous unions were viewed as adulterous, the missions had little hesitation in ruling that these marriages must come to an abrupt end if the partners wished to become Christians. They thus turned the good news of the gospel into bad news. In 1957, Henry Venn, secretary of the Anglican Church Missionary Society, drew up a memorandum which concluded that, quote, a polygamist cannot be fully admitted to baptism into the Church of Christ. This influenced the debate for the next century. However, some individual missionaries came to understand the human situation better and to have doubts. So much turmoil surrounded the issue by 1888 that it was brought to the Lambeth Conference, the highest body in the Anglican Church. The bishops there voted that male polygamists should not be baptized as Christians, but kept under instruction until they were in a position to conform to the law of Christ. This position had great influence among not only Anglicans in Africa, but also other Protestants there, even though several churches continued to baptize polygamists in Asia, especially China. Church policy thus, in effect, made polygamy the unforgivable sin. Only divorce could qualify Reformed polygamists for entrance and fellowship in the kingdom of God. the Lambeth document was less adamant concerning polygamous wives, allowing their baptism in some circumstances, these being left to local decision. The policies generally presented a polygamous male convert with one or two choices. The first, which was initially the most common practice, was that he should put away all but one of his wives before being baptized. There was further variation here, for some insisted that the first wife be the one retained, others allowed him to choose which one he wanted. This choice was wrenching to the kinship system, for it often separated the discarded wives from their children, and left some so destitute that they were forced into prostitution in order to survive. Although cast out, wives were eligible for baptism. The end result of the policy was often their alienation from Christianity.
With the passing of time, Protestants came to view polygamous unions not as adultery, but as an inferior form of marriage, which, if divorce was demanded, was likely to result in unacceptable dislocation. Many concluded that if divorce was demanded, many concluded that it was therefore better to maintain them, even though they represented an unsurmountable impediment to baptism. Consequently, the pendulum swung increasingly toward the second alternative, under which all wives were eligible for baptism, but the male was kept waiting without baptism on the periphery of the church until the death of a wife or wives left him with only one spouse. Catholics, for their part, were more firmly convinced that polygamous unions, polygamous relationships were adulterous and therefore not marriages. Consequently, their traditional solution was akin to the first choice listed above. The polygamist must send away all but one of his wives before he could be baptized. The question of the possibility of baptizing the wives and under what condition was not ever raised. The concern was the man and his baptism. During the 20th century, the problem was sharpened once many independent African churches accepted polygamous members began to emerge in West Africa, and as the missions became more aware, lost my line here, more aware of the harm their policies were causing to the polygamous Africans. For example, it was realized that kinship groups often refused to permit the divorces churches demanded, and that efforts to have a husband support his wife and children without having a sexual relationship created enormous strains that often ended up with pregnancies. Recent studies, Adventists entered, wrong page. Recent studies had shown that the traditional family was disintegrating in the mushrooming urban areas. The Christian policy toward polygamy was held partially responsible for this. It had taught many societies the possibility of divorce. With a breakdown of the family on every hand, it not only appeared to so self-evident to the churches that polygamous families should be separated. Instead, a number of churches began to see it as their primarily responsibility to promote marital fidelity and stability. They therefore began to rethink the whole issue in the light of contemporary circumstances. Policy and practice began to change in the decades after World War II, slowly at first, then with increasing pace. The first mission-connected church to decide to baptize male polygamists was the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Liberia in 1951. An All-Africa seminar on the Christian home and family in 1963 recommended that whole polygamous families could be baptized and admitted to communion. This led to a period of intense discussion, and several smaller missions acted on the recommendation. However, the larger missions did not yet do so. New articles and books urged the baptism of polygamists began to appear more frequently, now in Catholic as well as Protestant circles. In 1970, the Anglican Archbishops of Africa commissioned a report on Christian marriage in Africa. This defined polygamous marriage as not a number of loose sexual relationships, but of some simultaneous stable unions contracted under a form of law, recognized as marriage by the people of the country, entered upon with a lifetime intention, and providing both a permanent home and a legitimate status for offspring to end a polygamous marriage in the name of Christ, who said nothing explicitly to condemn it at the expense of effecting of a divorce which Christ explicitly forbade, is too high a price to achieve theoretical conformity with one part of the Christian marriage pattern. That's, Ron, is an amazing statement right there. Give myself a bit more light. It was also noted that Christian men felt obliged to divorce a barren wife rather than merely add another, thus learning the American practice of serial monogamy. Later, it also became obvious that the rejection of polygamy resulted in more adultery, venereal disease, and HIV/AIDS. The Anglican study therefore urged the baptism of intact polygamous families that had existed prior to conversion. The fruits of this study were harvested at the 1988 Lambeth Conference, which, at the initiative of the East African bishops, reversed the ban on baptizing polygamists unless they retained only one wife. The bishops argued that the existing policy resulted either in women and children being abandoned or the loss of converts to other faiths. The resolution voted by the conference upheld monogamy as the ideal and forbade converted polygamists from taking additional wives. It said nothing about polygamists not being able to hold church office. Okay, our next section is Adventist missions and polygamists. So I'm going to go there. This is page 5 for those of you who are following along. Adventists entered Africa when the Christian mission enterprise there was already well established. Since Adventists thought of themselves as God's special remnant church, they kept their mission efforts quite separate from those of other churches. Consequently, they developed their own responses to polygamy. However, because their missionaries were also drawn from Europe and America, and they were often very conscious of their reputation with the major religious bodies, their policies often reflected the practices of other missions. They were wary lest the standard that they adopted be deemed too low by others. And I thought this first line that Ron used here was very expressive, that Adventists steered an erratic course at first. In 1913, the missionaries were at their headquarters in Washington, D.C., were called to a roundtable conference to discuss a recommendation drafted by a committee on the question of polygamy in heathen lands. Their discussion revealed considerable variation, and I listed some of them here on the screen. Most Adventist missions refused to baptize polygamists. Adventists in India followed the practice among the missions there, baptizing converted polygamists but not allowing them to hold prominent church offices. Wide differences in how the wives involved in polygamous marriage were treated. While most missions encouraged polygamists to put away their additional wives, those in Korea and South Africa required the man to support all of his wives while living with only one of them. Missionaries from China and Java found fault with their insistence on divorce as being unfair to the women and children. The group eventually recommended that when a polygamous man became a Christian, he be accepted into the church on condition that he support all his wives and children, but that he lives only with his first lawful wife as husband and wife. He would be eligible to hold church office. Similarly, a plural wife would need to separate from her husband before being granted membership. That is, no would-be convert who continued to live polygamously would be baptized. Although the original recommendation coming to the group had allowed wives who could not obtain a divorce from their husbands to be accepted as members, this was rejected when missionaries reported that other mission churches would not tolerate this. These recommendations were then voted by the General Conference. However, in 1913, the guidelines failed to achieve uniform practice among Adventist mission. The extent of diversity in practice was revealed by a second missionary roundtable in 1926. Now, I'm going to just summarize this. What had happened was that there was some realignment of fields, Ron, as I recall, and that changed some different groups and put them in different groups. But W.H. Branson, who, by the way, is grandson, I believe, of Roy Branson, grandfather of Roy Branson and Ron Numbers, uh,
Yes.
was the president of the division, and he realized the weight of opposition among people to the imposition of divorce and polygamous families. Since the division included both matrilineal and patrilineal societies, in some parts divorce was easy, other parts it was impossible. For that reason, we agreed to compromise somewhat, and we agreed to baptize those who come to the knowledge of the church straight from heathenism. However, according to scripture, such members were not eligible to hold church office. In contrast, the European division, which now encompassed East and West Africa, which was mostly patrilineal and highly polygamous, abided strictly by the 1913 statement and therefore baptized no practicing polygamists. Although it was sensitive to the human and social problems caused by requiring people to break up their polygamous union, its spokesperson referred to the necessity of having to refuse baptism to genuinely converted polygamists as one of the saddest experiences in Africa. But yet they felt the compromise was too dangerous in this stronghold of heathenism. However, polygamists were baptized in India, but not in the Far Eastern and China divisions. The 1926 conference revealed such a divergence of opinion and practice that church leaders decided to appoint a committee to give careful study to the question of polygamy and the stand that should be taken with regard to it. This drafted a conservative resolution countermanding the new policy of the African division, which is given highest authority when it was passed by the General Conference in session. Henceforth, in no case should a man living in polygamy be admitted into the fellowship of the church. The 1926 division caused upset in the African division. For example, one of the missionaries there sent to church headquarters a manuscript arguing forcefully against the policy of breaking up families, stressing the hardships and degrading consequences that the native women endure who are forced to give up their homes and oftentimes their children when they are put away by their husbands because of having accepted the Christian faith. The division's appeal succeeded in having a committee appointed to study polygamy among primitive tribes, with Branson as one of the 3 committee members. This committee's report was treated with such urgency that it was taken to the annual meeting of the leaders of the World Church in 1930 rather than waiting for the 1932 session. The resolution voted there dramatically reversed the 1926 decision, permitting the baptism of polygamous converts in those cultures where tribal customs would result in great injustice to innocent cast-off wives and their children. This gave the church, listen to this line that Ron wrote, this gave the church a policy that was much more liberal than those of the major mission churches in Africa and remarkably independent of their views. However, the European divisions rejected this policy on the ground that a decision made by a General Conference session had been overturned by the lower body and continued to adhere to the more restrictive 1926 session. I will add here, Ron, that the same thing happened when a session of the General Conference recommended the ordination of women elders, and some parts of the world said, no, that wasn't recommended by a session, it was recommended by an executive committee, and they rejected it. And what's interesting about that is it is only in the last 2 weeks that Latin America finally voted to let women elders be ordained. So it was easy for hardliners to arouse opposition to a liberal policy toward polygamy in the US and Europe. A major element in the opposing case was that the liberal position gave other missions a reason to complain that Adventists were easy on polygamy. Church leaders, moved by the barrage, established yet another study committee, which resulted in the voting of new resolutions in 1941, this time at the session, and that had the effect of overturning the 1930 policy, and the Adventist Church thus settled on a conservative stance only a few years before such rules came under close critical scrutiny within the broader Christian community in Africa. And here's the crucial line: this policy is still the official position of the Adventist Church. I'm just going to read, I put up on the screen, Ron, these two paragraphs, because I thought they were important. Almost everywhere, the first option mentioned by Adventists I interviewed in Africa is for the polygynous man to divorce all wives except one before baptism is permitted. Some refer to an additional waiting period before baptism to ensure that the man is sticking to his decision. In some areas, he is expected to continue to support the wives he has cast out. However, because the experience in most of Africa has been that husbands are unwilling or unable to divorce their wives, a second option was usually listed. Under this, those wives who are converted are baptized. They are usually not regarded as polygamous because they have only one husband, but their husband is kept in a sad state on the periphery of the church, without baptism or access to communion, usually only as a Sabbath school member. In this second option, which has increasingly become most used, it is this second option. Indeed, in Nigeria, it has become the only practice, with no attempt being made to persuade the husband to divorce his wives. In Zimbabwe, the policy interpreted more strictly. If the second option is chosen, only the first wife is baptized on the grounds that she is the only innocent party. Beneath this pattern lies more diversity and flexibility in enforcement. And this has allowed influential church figures, missionaries, church administrators in different areas to interpret it differently. One missionary reported that we always tried not to disrupt a family if the children were small. Another told of a division president who was often said to baptize everyone if people were going to be hurt badly, but never put it in writing. Very interesting, Ron. Thank you for that. That's very insightful. While some administrators have tried to enforce the policy to the letter, others, noting the human disasters, have learned to back off. When divorce is imposed or chosen, Adventists usually allow the husband free choice concerning which wife will be retained, and this is often the youngest. The wives have no choice here. In the words of a former union president, wives must submit to what their husband chooses. It is very sad for a woman to be cast out in old age, yet for a young woman to be considered no longer a wife, especially where she is not eligible for remarriage, must be devastating. It is often the more conscientious husband who refuses the divorce option. While his wives are eligible to be baptized, become church members, and to partake of communion, he must remain at best on the fringe of the church so long as his plural marriage continues. He is always a second-class citizen. His tithes and offerings are expected, but he must leave when it is time for communion. Since he is not baptized, he worries that he may be eternally lost. The practice leaves him in spiritual limbo, marginalized from the community of faith, an almost impossible situation for a member of a communal society. Communities can never be one in Christ when there are two such distinct statuses. It is not surprising, then, that many husbands tire of their ambiguous situation and disappear from the church, and that cast-out wives lose their conversion experience and often become embittered with the church. Consequently, the children are also lost to the church. So I'm going to move on to the next section here. Interesting division between how the pastors see it. The older pastors see the policy that keeps practicing polygamists from membership in the church as a litmus test, without which the church would not have a pure and noble profile. They also have a stake in the traditional policy. Their own marriage options were shaped by it. They had to give up the possibility of plural wives and possibly even had to abandon a wife. And they would feel deeply humiliated and betrayed if the policy were now abandoned. They have actually had to enforce it, Ron, as I understand it. They've had to tell people, get rid of your other wives, and to now back off from it would be very humiliating. On the other hand, the younger pastors regard the policy as doing more harm than good and is fatally flawed and morally bankrupt. A D.Min thesis completed by the then president of the Adventist College in Nigeria was an impassioned call for change. Is the proclamation of the gospel supposed to threaten family stability, disrupt social covenants, and separate mothers from their children? Is it not possible, at the very least, for the church to permit the baptism of a repentant, holy, and consecrated polygamist and his wives, if the gospel has reached them in this situation? I mean, that's an amazing question. Here's a quote from Bekele Heye, which I'm totally mispronouncing that. He told Ron the policy was wrong.
He was the president of the union, of the division.
President of the division, okay. He told me that the policy was wrong. The church was forcing harmony, it was forcing divorce. Women were left derelict, deprived of their homes and legal husbands. This was not in harmony with the Bible. We should have accepted polygamists as we found them, with multiple wives, and merely insisted that they add no more. So I brought it to the attention of the General Conference at Annual Council. Several others joined in the enterprise. And I'm just going to I'm going to summarize a bit here what I put on the screen. Few Americans and Europeans understood the issue. They found the thought of polygamy distasteful, and the prospect of admitting polygamous members made them fear for the reputation of the church. However, when Africans charged that the Westerners had been willing to countenance serial monogamy in the form of widespread divorce and remarriage in their own divisions, even though this clearly contravened statements attributed to Jesus in the Gospels, that they were now unwilling to support existing polygamous families in Africa merely because these were so foreign to their culture, even though there was some biblical support for polygamy. They softened their opposition. The prospects for a new policy, however, collapsed when African unity eroded. Older pastors who had been restricted to one wife by church policy bridled at the thought that polygamous men would be allowed to retain their wives. Many African pastors also expressed fear that an about-face on this issue would encourage lay members to question other positions held by the church. We have a summary of 5 issues here. I will just point out briefly. First of all, although Adventism was separated from other Protestant mission, it was very much shaped, its policies were very much shaped what they thought the other missionaries would think. Number 2, Americans viewed polygamists as being stigmatized. And I thought it was interesting, Ron said they were both sinful and perverse, rather like the way the majority regarded homosexuals. Decision makers in the church were moved with compassion for the human victims of the policy, but it was not expressed organizationally. The organization was never able to come to a new policy on it. When Adventists failed to understand the functions of polygamous unions and just labeled them adulterous, and as what you said in one place, Ron, they were just lustful. They were failing to contextualize the Christian message. An astonishing number of committees have studied the Adventist policy and come to differing conclusions, but there's also been a remarkable amount of individual flexibility within a centralized hierarchical system. And so Ron ended this by saying the pattern is similar to the issue of women pastors and lesbian and gay members, where changes in practice are increasingly circumventing the rules and showing a gradual but unofficial shift toward a compassionate embrace. And that's where we're going to stop. It's time for you to raise your hand, and I'm going to turn it back to Ron to answer your questions at this point.
Let me just say one thing about point number 3, about the church. Lots of people having compassion, but the denomination itself and its policies not. And I think an excellent example of this is that here you have the rules making such a mess of the wives' lives and their separation from their children, their loss of support. And the church is not doing anything to support those women. Mm-hmm. It doesn't think about a policy to come behind them, except to encourage men to, if possible, support their ex-wives, but you can't have sex with them. And that doesn't work out very well.
Right. Right. No, you've made that point abundantly clear. By the way, time to raise your hands. I'm not seeing any hands up here. So some of you, I know Lynn Boyd, I know Ayanda, some of you have had a lot of experience. You've seen this in these fields yourself. So it's really a pretty fascinating topic. But I think that the point that you make here in number 3 and number 5 both, Ron, is crucial, because what you're basically saying is that individuals have been pastoral and kind and tried to accommodate these dear poor people who were cast out and abandoned, but the policy cannot follow along. It seems have been unable to craft a policy that follows along here. Am I right?
Yes.
And so what has prevented this from becoming a policy?
It's astonishing how often Adventists don't want to change a policy that doesn't work because they're scared that if they change one thing, the people will start questioning more.
Do you think that's the primary reason?
I think that's one of the primary reasons. The other one, of course, is the people whose lives were changed by the policy and are now older, and they don't want to face that sort of, they don't want to see that change.
Yeah.
It would be like being told in the Chinese policy that you can have only one child, and reaching the stage where you can now have 3 or 4, but you've passed childbearing age, and so you missed out your opportunity.
Charlie, I'm gonna go ahead and call on you here. You ask an excellent question here in the Charlie Curting. You excellent question here, and I'd like you to go ahead and address that.
Which question was that?
Serial monogamy. You've just asked it in the chat.
Oh, yeah. I mean, my experience in North America, when I look at the pastors I've had over the years, the divorce rate has been a little lower than the general population, but not a lot. And again, this, this whole issue is, and there's a lot of other issues that seem to follow the same sort of pattern, is, we have what we hold up as an ideal and then what is real. And so the question really is, how do you strike that balance?
Mm-hmm.
What are the criteria you use to strike that balance?
I would guess that both Ron and you, Charlie, and a number of the others of you are old enough to remember when divorce was simply verboten. It was prohibited. If somebody got divorced, they didn't even, the actual policy said divorce and remarriage, but at least in the area I grew up, it was so conservative that just divorce alone was enough to earn you rejection from the church.
Yeah, disfellowship.
Yeah, disfellowship, in fact, just for being divorced. And it
Well, and
always
in
went to a
some
church
cases,
trial before the board, and it was somebody had to take the blame. And yeah, to now say you can have lots and lots of wives, and we'll still let you be or husbands, and we'll still let you be a church member, but you can't have them at the same time. In fact, you have to reject them. And what Ron says in this paper is that it was the rejecting that really caused the problems, kicking them out, pushing them away. Am I right?
Yes.
well, even things about I can remember when I was younger, there was even ostracization about if you were married to a non-Adventist.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, very much so. Ayanda, I'm bringing you in here because I wanted to ask you a question myself. And that is, Ayanda, where you live in Africa, is there, I know you're probably more in an urban setting now, in a more educated, sophisticated area, but do you know of polygamy still continuing where you are?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Need a little louder, Ayanda.
Oh, okay. All right. Let me fix something. Just give me a second. My, all right. Can you hear me now?
Can hear you now, yes.
All right. Okay, cool. Right. So, polygamy in the sense of the African culture, and I cannot speak for the whole of the continent, but here in South Africa, we still do have polygamy. Our constitution allows for polygamy, so you can be a polygamist, and it is legal. But of course, our church, as the document has stated, it has a different view. Personally, I have not encountered within the churches I've been to here in South Africa, I have not yet encountered a polygamist. It's only just been in, conversations with people who are planning to be polygamous, but I've not yet encountered a polygamist. Although where I live is not far from the rurals, or the countryside, but within the Adventists, I think for us, Adventism, it discriminates in our message. Wherever we go, we would hammer hard on a polygamist that somebody from joining the church. So yeah, but it's an ongoing debate. Actually, it just came out a few years ago, because there were kind of influential characters within the church here in South Africa who intend to be polygamist, and so now it's a debate. It's a debate because biblically, it's there. We all know it. We cannot argue against it. So now I think the church really needs to rethink its position on polygamy. Are we guarding people simply because we want to ready a church for the second coming, or we just want to monitor what happens about people there, what's in their fridges, what's in their bedrooms, how they dress? So yeah, so for me, I'm still a little bit, I used to be very solid when it came to polygamy, but now I'm a little bit, yeah, I'm on the fence with polygamy.
Yeah, Ron, do you want to respond to Ayanda?
I mean, it is very, very clearly a rural thing. And often Adventist missionaries went to rural areas. We went there after the other missionaries had set up their beachheads in the cities. And we were, for example, in Kenya, our area where most of the Adventists are is over near Lake Victoria. It's far from Nairobi, and so presumably we ran into a fair bit of polygamy. And in other words, the people who we were converting were already polygamously married. Now, these days, of course, we're becoming more urban because the whole society is becoming more urban, and that's less relevant because it's primarily a rural thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, what Ayanda also said was that the fact is that knowing how we feel about it discourages polygamists from even being interested.
Oh, yes.
They're not even showing up for the meetings.
Mhm.
They've told me, we're interested, we're coming to meetings, then we discover what the position is on polygamy, and we go either to the independent churches who accept us, or we become Muslims. And so it has the effect of driving people away. And crazily, it has the effect of driving away the wealthiest people and leaving us with lots of women. There are churches where, in a society where women don't count very much, have to be run by the women because there's no men. But the women cannot give without the husband saying give. So, and if the men have really been turned off, they're not going to do that. So it's a negative result in all sorts of ways.
Really, really interesting. And it reminds me a little bit. I thought toward the end of the paper there, where you made the comparison between how gay and lesbian people were treated as well. Again, the policy is against you, and knowing that the policy is there pushes gay and lesbian people away, even though there are pastors like me and a number who are here on this forum here today who do not have that attitude. But yet, who's going to come to an Adventist church knowing that the official policy is, we don't like you, right? Bob Martin, thank you for raising your hand. I really appreciate it. Go ahead,
Thank
Bob.
you, Loren. Dr. Lawson. Yeah, thank you, Loren. Dr. Lawson, it's all pleasure to hear you and to be around you. And I've been doing this from my young days at Columbia University, and it's still a pleasure to hear you. I see this as a form of theological colonialism and theological scriptural imperialism by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, two quick questions. Number one, do you think over time the Adventist Church will come to a more humane, practical, official position on polygamy, just as how they have now, pastors even get married and divorced now, which is not even an issue? Do you think it will dissipate, just as how we have overcome our obsession with divorce and remarriage? And secondly, what would you recommend as a practical, workable solution for the Adventist Church in terms of an official position on the issue?
Thanks, Bob. Good questions. From what I've been following things, of course, the most recent major attempt to change things in the more liberal direction was led by Neil Wilson, who had been a missionary for a number of years in Egypt, and knew that we were not going to make any headway with the Muslims while we refused to bring their whole families in. So he was very eager to get the change in the 80s when he was the president of the General Conference. And he was behind the sort of thing that I was talking about in the paper today. And as you saw, that did not work out. And I've not heard of any serious endeavor since then to do anything about it. And I think that that there's a sort of a sense that if we wait long enough, the issue is going to disappear with urbanization. And but meanwhile, people are still coming to the church. But at the same time, you've got this strange experience where people are closing their eyes to situations. And I mean, I had so many examples given to me in my in interviews across Africa. And these were, for example, at the time when I was there were a lot of Adventist missionaries, Adventist evangelists coming to Africa to do short-term campaigns, and they would preach for 3 weeks. And it was very interesting because it wasn't too long ago that you had to be a member of a Sabbath school class for 2 years before you could be baptized in much of Africa. They made major socialization before they did it. But now 3-week campaigns, and of course the whole idea was to build a reputation in America by being able to say I baptized 1,000 people in Africa, and so they'd have that, and then they'd want to have the baptism on the last day, and then to make another appeal so they could get even more. Right, that's the way baptisms are used in evangelistic campaigns. And well, in that time there was no way to do the sort of work to find out whether they were polygamous or not. So they were just simply baptizing them. And the administrators there, the mission presidents, said to me, you know, once they're baptized, we can't disfellowship them for something that they had before they were baptized. Once they're baptized, we've put our blessing on it. And so that's what's been going on. Meanwhile, there are those who are seeing the younger pastors in particular, seeing the problems, are just simply going ahead and doing it. Now, so let me come to to your other question. It seems to me that the most humane sort of response is the Anglicans' response, and that is to accept what you've got. I mean, who can say it's not biblical to have that sort of marriage if you've already got it? You know, is it better to break up the marriage, or is it better to make the best of what you've got? And anyway, are we saying that the only thing that God accepts is a one-by-one marriage? Because that's not true in the Old Testament. And what did Paul mean by an elder should be the husband of one wife? Does this imply that there were other people in the church who had more than one wife in the New Testament period? I'm not sure of that. I'm not a scholar of that period. But it's a question that when I read the New Testament, that's what comes to me.
All right, Dr. Seibold, unmute yourself.
Thank you, Loren. Ron, as you're aware, the correspondence between us tells you that I appreciate your work ever since I discovered your work over 3 decades ago to help my own understanding of biblical text through sociology. Now, I have a question that relates to something that Loren read in the essay, which I read as soon as it was posted. You said that the men in Africa had an answer to the General Conference position against them, and that answer they had provided them with evidence that polygamy is also in the biblical text. Here is my question. Which biblical passages you think they had in mind, and what was the official retort from the General Conference people?
There's one thing that hasn't been mentioned, it's in the paper, but wasn't mentioned today, which I think was quite influential in America. There is a revulsion in a monogamous society against polygamy. We just can't imagine it. Same way as for so long heterosexuals couldn't imagine homosexuality. It was just too far. And if you think about what happened to the Mormons when they started, they came through early in their days as polygamists. their founder had many, many wives, and so did the other leaders. But they ended up being, well, the founder was murdered and assassinated. And Mormons became absolute pariahs, and they had to move as a community, their headquarters and the community with them several times, eventually out of America, out of the claimed territories, over to Utah at that time. So this is the sort of mood in America which Adventists grew up in, thinking about polygamy. And I think that was one of the things that influenced us. It's what we knew and what we understood to be monogamous, and we assumed that was all that there was. I think the passages, for example, you've got, David was a man after God's own heart, right? and how many wives did he have? And even though what he'd done to Bathsheba, and also David in one of the Psalms, I remember, I can't tell you which one now, thanks God for sending him his wives. It's there in Scripture, okay? Those are the sort of things that I think that the polygamists can point their finger to, but you can't point your finger anywhere to the sort of situation we have with marrying one, divorcing, marrying another, divorcing, etc. So I think the polygamists are correct in pointing the finger, that why do we criticize them when we do what we do?
Thanks much, Dr. Liebert. I'm going to go ahead and mute you, and I'm going to, I'll apologize to Daniel and Lynn, but I want to jump down to a discussion that Ray and Bobby Stovall started and has been very active here in the chat. And it's a hard one, Ron, and I think maybe it will needs to come in at this point before we go any farther. And that is that Ray and Bobby asked, go ahead, Ray, or whoever's going to ask the question.
Well, this question in my mind comes up quite often on these issues, whether it's homosexuality, divorce, today polygamy. And a lot of times people say, well, it's because of our past history, Ellen White and so forth. But really this whole problem of sex and organized religion and churches seems to go back over the centuries. I have my own ideas of what its real issue with it is, but I'm not an expert. And so the question is, why is religion so obsessed about sex? What is it about religious ideas and sex that seems to be in juxtaposition with each other?
I think that's a good question, Ron.
I'm not sure I'm the expert to answer that one either, though. I think we tend to, especially with conservative religion, we tend to be pretty judgmental, and it's always good to be judgmental with other people rather than ourselves, isn't it? And that's the way we've been taught to be. So if you've got a marriage that's going smoothly, it's easy to point the finger at those who are having trouble. And of course, what we do is going to be the right way, and if they've got a different form of marriage altogether, with different numbers of people, well, that's shocking to us, and so it's behind us. This is the sociologist's response to this. You see, I'm not being I'm not a historian of the early church. I do remember a book which came out of Yale, as I remember it, which found that there was no strong church position, Catholic church position, against homosexuality until somewhere around about 1200. That came later, and that before that he found quite a lot of evidence of same-sex relationships in the church, which I suppose is easy enough given the insistence upon monogamy and upon not being married for the priests once that became the rule. But that's about all I can say. I really don't know the answers more than that.
I'm going to go here to my friend Daniel Mora. And Daniel, I'm going to give me just a moment here. I'll have you unmute, and then I'm going to unmute Carmen as well so she can translate for you. That'll make it a little easier. Go ahead, Daniel.
Daniel,
Hola,
si
Carmen.
¿cómo estás? Si vas a decir algo que es un poquito más largo, por favor, dilo en partes.
Okay.
¿Ok?
Primero, la presentación está muy interesante y quedé muy impactado sobre cómo las políticas adventistas destruyen vidas inocentes.
The presentation was excellent, and I remain very impacted by the reality of how Adventist policies can destroy lives.
Cuando yo voy a la Biblia, de una vez la iglesia interpreta cuando le conviene algunos puntos bíblicos como culturales, y cuando la Biblia contradice sus postulados, los postulados de la iglesia, entonces los quiere contextualizar.
It seems that the church sometimes interprets things that are cultural as biblical, and when it does not want to change things according to the Bible, it also then makes something cultural biblical.
La poligamia, Dios respetó la cultura y de hecho intervino en relaciones polígamas. Por ejemplo, cuando Jacob rechazó a Lea, Dios bendice a Lea, interviene en el honor de Lea para que no fuera descuidada por Raquel.
What God protects are the people. For example, with Rachel, God protects her and her honor.
Okay, Dios interviene y bendice el vientre de Lea, okay, porque Jacob estaba rechazando a Lea por Raquel, y Dios interviene en esta relación polígama, la respeta en su cultura.
God respects that polygamous union, but blessing Leah and the fruit of her womb, because otherwise she would have been wronged. And so God is actually respecting the culture and what it would mean to the people.
Mi pregunta para el expositor sería, ¿hasta qué punto la cultura anglosajona y la cultura puritana que moldea la mentalidad norteamericana del siglo XIX es la que se está imponiendo sobre la lectura de la Biblia?
My question for the presenter is, how much is culture impacting interpretation on polygamy? How much of it is Anglo-Saxon and Puritan and 19th century cultural understandings impacting our interpretation?
Gracias.
De nada.
Thank you, Daniel. Good question. I want to respond with a piece that is going to be in my book whenever it comes out, if God lets me finish it before I die. I got far too many interviews. That's my problem. 5,700 of them, just so you get some sort of sense of the size of my ambition. What I argue when I come to Adventists and social issues is that in certain social issues, initially Adventists were really quite radical. We were not influenced by the grabbed position in society, by the accepted position. In particular, race. Just consider that we were prepared to break the law, and in the Underground Railroad, in our support and use of the Underground Railroad, and our position initially on and blaming America as being the beast of Revelation 12, not because of Sunday laws initially, but because of slavery and because of its treatment of the African Americans. Also, the use of women. Now, we had women. A woman prophet for a start, and then women pastors and evangelists. We were treating women like that, you know, like normal pastors. Ellen White's position was, we have a message to give out. Let's use everybody we can get. Anyone who's prepared to preach can preach. So we had men and women doing it. Now, there were certain social issues where it never occurred to us that they would be our issues. We didn't expect to have divorce. We expected that Adventists would have perfect marriages. So we just assumed that divorce was bad. We did not expect that Adventists would have births out of wedlock. That was bad. We did not expect that there would be LGBT people in the church. That was bad. We were just accepting society and things like that. But in some of these issues, we were heavily influenced as time passed, as we put down roots in society, as we started to have upward mobility, and we became much more concerned about what others, and our reference group was the conservative religious groups. And so we became concerned with what the fundamentalists thought of us. And so we changed position on women. We became willing, once we entered the South. I mean, the major issue, of the big change in position on blacks being segregated happened when there was this a forum meeting given by Doug Morgan. So I'm quoting him. Where he told of what happened to the church in Washington, D.C. when the General Conference moved there at the beginning of the 20th century. We had one church in Washington, D.C. at that time, and it was integrated, very comfortably integrated, proudly integrated, well known to be integrated. The General Conference moved, and they became nervous about that and tried to separate the church. And some of them wouldn't be separated, so you ended up with three churches. The integrated church remained, but there was also a white church and there was a black church. And this happened because of the General Conference pushing for segregation. And similarly, when we come to polygamy, I find it astonishing that from 1930 to 1941, we officially held this really radical view that we will leave polygamous families existing intact. The existing ones who become Adventists will leave them intact. But as we become more concerned about what other missions are thinking of us, as they are saying, you're setting a bad example. You're being soft on polygamy. Then we change. And once we embrace a conservative position, because it's the truth, we have great difficulty getting away from it. We're stuck with it, even though we start to unofficially make changes. But the official policy remains the same. So I see this as an important dynamic in Adventism. We're not hearing you, Loren.
That's very profound, Ron. Thank you. I really appreciated that statement. Lynn Boyd, how many wives do you have?
Currently one, thank you.
Oh, and unfortunately, you can't be with her right now, I think, right?
Yeah, the immigration people still have to get their act together, so we are impatiently waiting. But I hope to visit her again in August.
Good, good. Have you encountered this, Lynn, in your travels? Have you, when you worked for NGOs in Africa, did you encounter polygamy?
Yeah, well, it's endemic in certain parts of Africa. I think everywhere in Africa, although I can only speak about the parts I've been to in Southern Africa. I shared a short. The first time I encountered it was in South Africa, actually in the 1990s, when I was teaching at Heidelberg College, and we did a well, I suppose we would say internal Maranatha, our own Maranatha trip up north to help a church being built in one of the homelands at the time. And those homelands have since been abolished. And but it was interesting when I went there. We had personal reasons for going there as well, but the church itself was being built by the chief of the area, who was really the recognized leader of the church. But he had too many wives, interestingly enough. And he was forced to give up some of his wives. He kept, he was an honorable man and tried to support them all. He was rich, very rich. And the comment made previously about, this policy kind of mitigating against the more wealthy people in Africa is probably true. Let me just say, I don't know exactly what he was doing or how he dealt with this, but I do know that his first wife was the one that he kept in just like Dr. Lawson presented. And so I'm not sure what actually happened since that time. But I do know that the man was not just a church leader, but a political leader. He became the first representative in parliament for that area. And it struck me as a really strange situation that the church was in. But so my contribution here is not really a question for Ron, but an observation of that personal experience, but also my own personal experience, because when I was in Mozambique, I met a non-Adventist girl, and we started dating. She became a Seventh-day Adventist in the process, and then we were married. But I was struck by the comment in the chat by Ray Stovall that it's all about power and control. And also the comment by Bob Martin about the colonialism that's going on. We have this stuff coming over from a different culture that doesn't really serve the other cultures very well. So in my case, I was shocked. We decided to get married. And my wife had been a Seventh-day Adventist for several months. My fiance had been a Seventh-day Adventist, and we'd been engaged since she became baptized, because it would have been disaster for me if I had been engaged sooner. They would have put me out of the church immediately, or very shortly, if she had not been baptized. And then I mentioned to one of my employees, who was the elder at the church, I said, you might as well announce the church we're going to get married in a couple months, so they will understand that we are going to be married. And he said, well, I'll take it to the church board. And I thought to myself, whoa, why would you do that? It turns out that the church board has to okay a marriage in that area. And then I was struck by all the control that the church seemed to want. And I don't know where that comes from, but I believe we're talking about a problem of control. And it seems to me, as I've written in a comment here, the flexibility, if we want to have a policy that crosses all cultures and times, you can only do that when important decisions are made locally. And if those guys at that local church think they needed to have a church board action for somebody to get married and to have permission to get married, well, maybe that was good for them. I mean, I came from a different culture. It seems strange to me. I wasn't too worried about it. But it seems to me this is the issue is less about polygamy and more about control and public relations. And I don't know, I'm not qualified really to speak to the theological aspects of it, but that's what I observe organizationally. Thanks.
Thanks, Lynn.
I can give you
Ron,
one.
go ahead.
One strange case. During I think it was the 90s, the Governor General, that's the position as representative of the Queen, and so it's an honorary position, but considered very important in Papua New Guinea, was an Adventist. And he was brought to the General Conference, and a great deal of fuss was made of him, as you might expect. He was a polygamist. And he was known to be a polygamist. And it was interesting that if you reached that high, it didn't matter. You could be still honored by the General Conference session.
That's fascinating. Let me mention a couple of things. People were talking about the biblical aspects of it, and Lynn mentioned it as well. And I just want to clear one thing up here. Ron is correct that polygamy, or many of you who have mentioned that polygamy was very common in the Old Testament. And to my knowledge, I could be wrong, but I don't think there is anything that prohibits polygamy in the Old Testament. There's certainly a cautionary example in how complicated it was for the patriarchs' families. Polygamy was a cause of much of their conflict and their problems, I think. But I don't see a whole lot, anything there that prohibits it. The thing that people always bring to it, and again, let's just keep in mind that we're Christians, we're New Testament people. We say generally that the New Testament supplants most of the Torah, the Pentateuch, rules and laws, with the exception of the Ten Commandments. Am I right on that? I think I can say that. So I got distracted by the things that people are saying in the chat here. Yeah, so the Old Testament really doesn't prohibit polygamy, but we have one text in the New Testament that appears to make polygamy complex, and that is the text in the Epistle to Timothy about being the husband of one wife. And we have generally thought that meant polygyny. I'm not sure it does. I've been doing some study on that recently, and at least one of the popular interpretations now is that polygamy was pretty much unknown in the Roman Empire at that time. It was considered barbarous. It was something that the barbarians and northern tribes did, not that Christians did. And so one of the common interpretations right now, which surprised me, this was totally new to me, that I found it in several places, that they said that it actually was speaking not of polygamy, but of having mistresses or being adulterous. A husband of one wife means, or the other alternative explanation is that it was saying that if a person's wife died, he shouldn't marry somebody else, or perhaps he shouldn't be divorced. So those are now alternative explanations that I've been encountering as I've been studying this matter. It isn't clear to me, Ron, that the passage in, is it 2 Timothy on having more than, that an elder must be a husband of one wife is actually about polygamy or polygyny. It could actually be about some sort of moral adulterous arrangement or divorce. Have you ever heard that, Ron?
No, I haven't, Loren, I haven't. But then I've not heard too much about discussion about that verse in these terms at all.
Yeah.
It's something I've run into in my own reading and wondered about, having become aware of polygamy.
Yeah, I think probably it'd be interesting to get one of our New Testament scholars, Dr. Johnston or one of the other folks who are New Testament scholars and ask them to speak on that. Oh, Olive is here. Maybe we can ask Olive to address that. But I did read that in a couple of places where they're suggesting, no, it's not about polygamy. Olive, do you want to set me straight? There you go.
Not that I'm setting you straight, but sometimes you must know that people like to go into the scripture and make up stuff. Who says polygamy was not a part of ancient Roman Empire? I'm not sure. The Roman Empire was made up of many colonies, and indeed polygamy was part of it. The text, when it said, but the church was trying to do away with that. And thus, for the elder, the one who is leader, must set an example and have only one wife. Now, I don't know where that new research comes in, but sometimes people, like to skew things to make up their own theological ideas. You read any of the histories on the Roman Empire, there was polygamous practices there. So I don't know where they got that from.
Okay. Thank you, Olive. You're beeping, by the way. Art says going to the Bible and making up stuff is a hallowed Christian tradition. Well, aren't you a cynic? All right, I'm going to go on to Gina Jett, and I'll ask you to unmute.
I'm going to raise a question that I raised in the chat, and it's since God has asked us not to judge and that he is the judge, why is it the church's job to decide who's in and who's out, to choose different groups of people that they exclude, for example, LGBT people, polygamists? Is this really the province of the church to decide this, or shouldn't we just leave it up to God? If God is the judge, why do we need to get involved in it? It seems like our church gets very involved in dress code issues, what people wear, whether they wear jewelry, whether in my day, whether their skirts were too short or whether they could wear jeans. And this became huge fodder for church discussions and policy decisions. And now, which groups are in and which are out. We don't exclude greedy people from our church or people who covet and say they're sinners and they can't come back. Does the church take on the job of being a screening agency that keeps out people who aren't good enough for the kingdom? Or do you think God would rather have us bring people in and be baptized who believe in him and work out the details later instead of being obsessed on following rules? I thought the comment about the man from Africa who had to be in a Sabbath school class for 2 years before he could be baptized, there's nothing biblical about that. It's just very disconcerting. So that's my observation. It seems like this polygamy discussion brings up a bigger question about the church and whether it should be an enforcement arm or a screening agency.
Ron, that's a very good question. Is there something about our more sectarian church that tends to want to be more highly controlling of small things? As you know, we find it rather typical of several of the American born churches. You know, the Mormons are very highly controlling on appearance and what you eat and drink and all of that too. Why are so many of us so oriented in that direction?
It, it seems to me really sad that, and there's, you know, some of you know, I'm a musician, and I've had two careers, and one has been as a church musician, and I've been an organist for most of my life, or a singer, as a paid musician in Anglican and then Episcopal churches as I changed countries. And I must say that the Anglican church and Episcopal churches doesn't ask those sort of questions. It's just an astonishing contradiction, contrast with what we do. I mean, when you consider, for example, to what extent jewelry has been an issue, and it's so often been used against women, and nobody looks at the parking lots, which is where you find the male jewelry, and that's fine. You can have a tremendously expensive car sitting there, but if you have a couple of $100 on your finger or around your neck, it's something of horror. I found it extremely sad. And I then remember the quotation in the paper where the European division refused to even during the Liberal period from 1930 to 1941, the European Church division refused to allow the polygamous people to be baptized. And they said how sad it was to take somebody who was converted and clearly converted, but say, no, you can't be baptized. Isn't that absurd for a Christian organization to be doing?
It does seem astonishing, doesn't it? I don't know how many of you have read a piece. Probably we ought to have a class about this, and maybe I will. I've got a couple of open Sabbaths, by the way, coming up. But I wrote a piece with my old friend Greg Jones called The 29th Fundamental Belief. Did any of you read that in the magazine? The 29th Fundamental Belief is you can pick and choose between any of the first 28, and as long as you're kind and gracious to others, you can still be a member of the church. And it got a lot of response. People really seemed to like it. Somebody coined the term a 29th fundamental belief church. We're a 29th fundamental belief church, the church that allows you to pick and choose between the first 28, whatever you want, and ignore them or accept them. But as long as you're kind and gracious, you're going to be welcome in our community. I thought that was wonderful. I got the idea from him, and then he and I crafted it together. And perhaps it's something that we ought to spend some time with. Next person up is my friend Ed Reisnider. Ed, tell me first of all, well, where are you? Now I lost you here, Ed.
He's there.
Oh, there, okay. Ask to unmute, Ed. Before you go any farther, Ed, please tell us how your wife is. Is she recovered from her serious illness?
Janelle is doing much better. She is gaining strength a little bit day by day. It's a long process, but she's definitely on the mend, and I appreciate your interest.
Well, we have several folks here who are active participants in the forum who have had health problems of various kinds. I know Gina Jett has mentioned that she's struggling with them as well, and she's one of my fellow teachers of the class. And so just remember these people, keep them in your prayers. But go ahead with your question, Ed.
Well, it's more a comment than a question. I was really intrigued with Ray's question about why is the church, and I interpret the church rather broadly, so interested in sex, almost preoccupied with it. And I think it's an interesting question. And I'm looking at an article on my iPad from the New Yorker magazine entitled "How St. Augustine Invented Sex." And, you know, Augustine lived in the 4th century. He said terrible things about sex. He said terrible things about women. He was quite misogynistic. And I think sometimes we don't fully understand the impact the church of the first few centuries AD have on us today. I mean, we waltzed into the family of churches as Seventh-day Adventists, fully accepting that the canon that the early church people came up with was right.
Yes.
We waltzed in and bought into many of the decisions of the councils on things like the Godhead and the nature of Jesus. And, you know, a high percentage of what we believe came from the early Catholic Church. And I suspect that attitudes from St. Augustine, which he embedded in Christianity, and he associated sex with original sin, which he originated as well. I suspect that we've inherited a Christian preoccupation with sex and its potential evil. And it's not just us, it's all of Christianity. And perhaps we can trace it right back to the 4th century AD.
Ed, let me ask you something. Somebody here on the chat said something interesting. They said, I think a lot of this has something to do with controlling women and sort of scapegoating onto women the problem, just like happened in Genesis and in many times ever since, scapegoating onto women the problems that men have in controlling themselves in very many cases. What do you think of that?
Well, that would be a diversionary tactic, wouldn't it? You know, men seem to have a different sort of sexuality than women in some part, and perhaps are more often aggressors. Yeah, that would be a good thing to do, put the blame on somebody else.
Well, when we do it even legally, if you look at law courts, for example, when there's a rape trial, traditionally, although this is being outlawed in some places, traditionally, if there was a rape trial, one of the questions was, Miss Smith, what were you wearing the night that you say that Mr. Jones raped you? How many men have you had sex with? Implying that it was her clothing that made him rape her, or it was, if she has had sex with other men, that gives any man permission to have sex with her. I mean, that is a well-established concept in human, even in our legal system, much less in the church. I mean, the church was always blaming women for things. I don't know, Ron, do you want to step into this?
The thing that occurred to me when Ed was talking was that as I've traveled around the church to every division, it's astonishing how often one of the arguments that was going on somewhere was whether it was okay to have sex on Sabbath, whether husbands and wives could show love that way to each other on a Sabbath. And I found that really fascinating because as somebody who's lived for 45 years in New York City, I knew that for an Orthodox Jew, it was his duty to have sex on Sabbath as long as his wife was clean by their definition. So for most of them, not for part of the month, but they had to do it. It was one way of making sure by Friday night that the Sabbath, all the ill feelings were gone, and that was the way they thought about it. And whereas for us, it's just too much fun on Sabbath.
It is fascinating, isn't it? I would say that this concept of scapegoating also comes into play and has come to play in my lifetime with gay people as well, Ron. The church loves to scapegoat onto people who they consider to be aberrant in sexual matters.
Oh, absolutely. You're right.
And so the whole idea that gay people are out recruiting, and the new book has just come out saying that transgender people are recruiting people to change their sexual orientation or their sexual their sex actually. Just astonishing. No actual truth to it, but that's how it goes. Hey, Chris, you've had a lot to say here in the chat, and so I want to bring you into this discussion, if you would, please.
Well, I'll have to beg the group's forgiveness for all my inane comments in the chat. Sometimes it's just a way of staying focused and engaged, and sometimes I get a little cynical there. I really appreciated reading the article, the brief part on the Adventist today, and then the full article this morning. I was struck, first of all, as if I was an Adventist minister, Loren, over the last years, to have to give my congregants a token that they would have to present to the deacon to get a communion wafer, like happened in the Middle Ages. To be in communion with the Catholic Church, you had to go to confession, you got a token, and you could bring it then for communion. I'm so glad Adventists have open communion. And I always talked about that and preached that and relished that. That brings up a whole nother topic of, can our unbaptized children take communion, which I think we've talked about here, or at least can again in the future. For me, and this impacts my opinions on LGBT as well, but the North American musical movie of Fiddler on the Roof is instrumental. And the whole idea of human relationships is at play in this discussion. You know, just the idea of you choosing who you get to marry is a radical thought in North America for romance rather than political reasons. You know, you look back in history and the alliances between nations were made between princesses being married off to princes of other nations and things like that. This was just fascinating reading for me. I learned a lot, so I really appreciate that. And it brings up the idea of freedom around the world, freedom versus control. Ecclesiastical council control, you can't do it unless the GC has spoken. Just a great historical thing. And it makes me sad that control is such of an issue in religion rather than allowing freedom that comes through faith in Christ. And the Acts 15 council, we're not going to make the Gentiles be circumcised, was so much wisdom, and it serves as a model for all aspects of church, topics of disagreement from different cultures and parts of the world. Let people do what they need to do to advance the kingdom where they are. Fascinating that it kind of has huge impacts on the whole women's ordination discussion from Africa to North America as well. So just sent my brain off in all kinds of different directions and was amazing. So thank you very much, Ron, for the work on that and helping us to see that.
Thank you.
Do you want to comment, Ron?
I said thank you.
Oh, okay. All right. Chris, as a fellow pastor, I often think about how I would have loved to have been in a community where there really was no judgment. Wouldn't that have been wonderful? In fact, generally speaking, there was a lot of judgment of not only of one another, but the pastor was the chief person that you wanted to judge because he was usually wrong about something. And it just fascinates me. When I mentioned this to somebody one day, they said, yes, but what would the church be if we didn't have standards? We have to have these standards. And the standards don't seem to be that we're kind to one another. They seem to be sort of external standards. What would the church be if we didn't tell people how to keep the Sabbath, or tell people what to eat, or tell people how to live and be married, not to get tattoos, all of these many things. Have you ever thought about that, Chris?
That would, yes, I have.
I don't think,
and
I don't think it'd be even possible to do that in any given church. You'd have to create your own.
Well, as I said before, I think on here, I grew up within a smelling distance of the Loma Linda food factory in La Sierra. I was raised with the aroma of linguettes every morning. And so I was raised in a vegetarian home. But when I went to Africa and did a share hymn meeting, the Sabbath school superintendent of the conference was there with a newly baptized candidate celebrating his baptism into the community and into Christ and fellowship. And he was eating goat. And it didn't bother me. I've, long since moved beyond that. But if you tell certain segments of the Adventist church that goat was on the menu, they would be aghast with that spirit of judgment. How could we get to the spirit, removing the spirit of judgment and getting to the point of the great fishnet of Jesus, who said the kingdom gathers all people? Some of us are enjoying the Chosen TV series here. It's a worldwide thing. And the kingdom is a big kingdom, and it's a big net, and it gathers all people. And the angels sort them out at the end. You don't have to sort them out on your July business meeting at church. You don't have to sort them out now. The weeds and the tares grow together. Should I pull up the weed? No, let them grow. The harvest will figure it out. We'll see what's a tomato plant and what's a dandelion in the harvest. And wow, if we had that community, what a difference life would be, because we'd focus on people rather than policy. This is a policy over people. We don't care what it did to the women and children in Africa. Who was thinking of them? No one.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll throw in here, just before Atss gives us our benediction, a funny story, Chris, that you will enjoy. Since you mentioned goat, I have a friend who was pastor of a big Filipino church. And this group of people didn't have much money, but they built the whole church themselves by hand. A few things maybe they contracted out, but most of it they did themselves. And they did a beautiful job. They built a really nice church. And I asked the pastor one time, what's the secret of getting everybody out for long days every week, every Sunday? They would get together. I said, what's the secret for getting everybody out and working hard as the Union Village Church? He said, a goat. And I said, what do you mean a goat? He said, every week I go and get a live goat, and I tie it up next to the place. And while everybody's working, one of the guys goes over and kills and butchers the goat and puts it over a great big fire. And everybody stays around for supper with the fresh goat. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way to build a Seventh-day Adventist church. And it worked. It was one of the more successful churches in the area. I thought,
today the bulletin announcement says drink and dessert will be provided at potluck. There it was, goat will be provided. What a twist on that.
Yeah, interesting. Atss, my friend, thank you for being here. And you're going to have a prayer for us, and I really appreciate that. Okay. Oh, by the way, just to remind everybody, we have a prayer, but we'll keep going for as long as people want to talk after the prayer. But Atss, how are things where you are?
Things are going very well. Super hot, finally feeling like summer. So that's good.
Yeah, good. I love your teapot that's behind you there. That's so pretty.
Okay, let us bow our heads and just be grateful for our time together. Our Father in heaven, we are so thankful that you have left us words of truth on which we can base our living. You have sent Jesus Christ as a model for us. And so today, as we've just talked for the last couple of hours, I ask that you will help us to reflect on the words that are shared, the thoughts and ideas that come from that, and to entrust ourselves to the Holy Spirit so that we can do what he's asking us to do. Wake us up to the place and presence of the Spirit, Lord, so that we understand what it is you're trying to have us do. Your goal is to save us, and you will save us from wherever we are as we respond directly to you. As we come together in community, we just thank you for this place that we found where we can openly share these thoughts and feelings and expressions and have you fix them in our minds so that we get them right to go back into the world and other spaces to live them out. I thank you for the hope that we have that one day all of this will be over and we will be able to spend eternity with you. In the meantime, I pray that you will heal the bodies of all of us who are sick, all of us who are in need of physical help in our journey here. And bind our hearts together in love, I pray, until we meet again. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Artist. Beautiful prayer. Ron, I do have another hand up here. I did. Where is somebody had a hand up here? Anyway, we do need a little bit. I would like. Oh, there it is. Kamika Warren. Hi, Kamika. Let me just mention here, Ron. It seems to me, most of us, with the exception of a few, like Lynn, who's worked in Africa, and others who live in Africa, we're not going to ever encounter this. Most of us who are sitting here listening. However, it seems to me that the really interesting part of this that we ought not to forget, and that you've commented on, and that is kind of part of all of our experiences, is the way this has shown that we are individually more compassionate than we are organizationally. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Why is it so hard for an organization to show compassion? I've really come to the conclusion that very rarely do timely moral statements come from the top of an organization. Timely moral decisions. Generally, it seems to me that the church follows rather than leads. It waits until it's safe, and then it says, oh yeah, by the way, we agree with that too.
That is a major finding of organizational sociology that you've just said. The most famous book is a book about the German Socialist Party in the 19th century, which was, of course, a radical party in the 19th century, as you might imagine. But as it got into the 20th century, it became much more concerned about keeping itself going and keeping the jobs there. And I think in the Adventist church, while I think some of our presidents have hoped to be the president when Jesus comes, I don't know whether that would mean a special hand to them from Jesus at the second coming, and sort of going first. But I think that what's really behind people is that that the leaders don't want to be the one in charge when the ship goes adrift, and so they don't want to do anything that might split the church, and there's a whole lot of emphasis upon keeping the church together upon unity, which by which they mean uniformity. And that's the way organizations behave. The bigger they get, the more that happens.
So tremendous fear of somehow damaging the organization, really, is what we're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, it is astonishing. Kamika, I'm going to ask you to unmute and join our conversation here. Are you there, Kamika?
I'm here.
Okay, there I see you. Okay, hi, Kamika.
I'm famous days.
Nice to meet you.
I'm a Jamaican. Okay. I'm grateful for this discourse, this actually gathering, because I want to say that basically I have been struggling as a young Adventist because I found myself in a position where I wanted to leave the church, but I couldn't really find anywhere else to go. And I realized, because I do appreciate, well, for the most part, the fundamental doctrines of the church. And when I think about some more, I find that as a church, we do not know how to love. Like, we have learned on many doctrines, but don't really fully understand what it means to love. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I found. So even this topic with the whole in different cultures, and so it really boils down to us not knowing how to, remove yourself from yourself and to put yourself in somebody else's position and choose and to speak from that perspective. And I found that, that is just something which I wanted to bring across. So when we're seeing the whole control as a church with all these teaching these things, I think we just really fundamentally do not know how to love. We have a misunderstanding of it, and we think that we are loving somebody by forcing and pushing and not necessarily knowing how to support someone.
Yeah. Kamika, thank you. That was a really meaningful and a heart cry, really, from you to try to understand it. Rather than turning to Ron for that, I'm going to turn to my friend Chris. Chris, I think all of us have struggled with that. How do we make our churches be loving places? As Kamika said, we don't really know how to love sometimes. And we're more, and maybe what Ron just said about that organizations being so afraid of sticking their necks out, maybe that affects it some way. What do you think, Chris?
That's exactly true. I mean, you stick your neck out like the Giraffe Society talks about. Sooner or later, your neck can get chopped off. I think a lot of pastors, they're caught in that lower middle management of a very large organization. Mm-hmm. They really don't have any authority. They're at the whim of the conference committee. And then, like you said earlier, sometimes pastors just get a target on their back. They're not conservative enough or liberal enough, or both, depending on which church they're in. And you can preach, pastors, there are many pastors who preach grace, love, and forgiveness week after week after week. There are other pastors who preach collar length and skirt length, and how you may probably not be saved, but you might be if you do these 45 things. Somewhere, I don't even want to be in the middle between those extremes. I converted to a grace orientation long ago through my own experience, my own life experiences. And God bless our pastors who keep preaching that, and our members who love those pastors and support them in doing that. May their tribe increase. But there's also the machine of the church, the gears of the church that still preach the standards. I just took a peek at the Sabbath School Quarterly for this quarter, and when it talks about rebelliousness, I kind of know what the undergirding is of that whole 13 weeks and what they're trying to address. That doesn't help things. It just makes things worse.
Yeah.
The bottom line is love the people around you, Loren, as you've said. Dig into a local church, make it what you can, and love the people around you that God places in your path to love. And it's like the old sand dollar illustration, I can't save all the sand dollars at the beach, but I can make a difference in the 10 that I can throw back in the surf during the time that I'm there.
I've always found that rather meaningful, actually. Yeah, Chris, I'll tell you a true story that happened to me some years ago in a big major church here in Ohio that I was a pastor of. One lady came up to me complaining bitterly about my sermons. I said, what is it wrong with my sermons? I said, I preach from the Gospels every week. I preach about the parables and about Jesus. And she said, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I am so sick of hearing about just Jesus. When are you going to tell us about the prophecies? And I mean, what do you say? To say I can't stand hearing any more about Jesus is just I was speechless, to be honest, Chris. And as
I'll give you my little personal testimony about the church I left. Won't name any names, but I kind of plugged into the One Project when they were doing things. It was just a breath of fresh air of Jesus, period, all, period. And I put that big at the bottom of my bulletin at the front. The week after I left, the powers that be went to the church board and asked to have that removed because it was a slogan of the One Project. And of course, they knew that the One Project was of the devil. When you lift up Jesus, you can't be doing the devil's work. If you're for Jesus, Jesus said, he who is with me can't be against me, or he that is not against us is for us. That idea. If I be lifted up, I will draw all men to me. You want Jesus to come? Start getting more people in love with Jesus.
Yeah. The preparation for Jesus to come is not to know the details of what's happening after one thing, what is happening after the other. The preparation for Jesus to come is to love Jesus, and I agree with you completely on that. Yeah, and by the way, I just saw that Atss got a letter this week from a person who said, in my church, we just got through with a 6-sermon series telling us why the One Project was evil. And she said, or he or she, I don't think it was specified, what do I say, what do I do? Because basically what it amounted to was that it was too much Jesus and not enough Adventism. And what do I say, what do I do? And I don't know. I'm gonna talk with Atss about this and see, because I don't even know what she's going to say about this. Robert, go ahead.
I want to change gears quite a bit here.
Sure.
Hopefully that's not a problem, but with a sociologist in our midst, I'd like to pick his brain. I've never had a class in sociology. I don't know if it's entirely descriptive or if it's also prescriptive. But remembering back to my high school government class, I remember us discussing the case. I had to refresh my memory on the name of it, but I guess it's Reynolds versus United States. But this was the case in which a Mormon man named Reynolds, this is like 1870-ish, had been prosecuted for a violation of a U.S. law, an anti-bigamy law. And the question before the Supreme Court was basically whether the First Amendment right to freedom of religion trumped this law. And the decision was that it did not, because if I recall right from my class many years ago, it was essentially that the argument was that the family is the building block of society. It's the foundation of society and of the state, therefore. And so the state had a prevailing interest in assuring the integrity of the family, and this was the basis on which this was struck down, if I'm remembering right. And Gina probably, or someone that's a lawyer, would be able to correct me on my probably flawed memory. But in any case, this continues to be an issue, here in the United States. I mean, we from time to time have the fundamentalist Mormon folks that get prosecuted for polygamy. And we had a case here in Texas a few years ago, out in West Texas, a Mormon man and his multiple wives. And in some cases, because the wives are minors, then there's some pretty serious ramifications in terms of statutory rape, et cetera, that go along with those. So I'm just curious, from a sociology standpoint, when you and your colleagues look at polygamy and the practice of polygamy, now let's just set Africa aside and talk about the United States, for instance. What do you see as the negative effects of polygamy? What are the positive effects of polygamy? Do sociologists kind of take a stance on whether it's something that benefits society or is harmful to society? And or do you just describe the process of what happens and don't take any kind of a prescriptive stance? I'm just curious how sociologists look at this issue of polygamy in a Western society like ours. Thanks.
Well, how this particular sociologist thought about it. I was at a camp meeting for the Adventist Singles Ministry one summer, doing research, not looking for a wife. And I was astonished that there must have been 10 women for each man that was there. And the women would complain to me about the quality of the men. These were mostly divorced women, okay? And the statistics are clear that when Adventists divorce, the man leaves the church and the women stay. That's the way it works. And so we've got, and then of course we've got a huge excess of unmarried women who haven't married in the first place. Boy, oh boy, the Adventist church needs polygamy. The same way as the Africans needed polygamy because they had all these spare women, because they'd had so many wars. Well, our wars have sent our men going, and the women have stayed. And it's a real problem. So that was my thought. I mean, I don't know that it was a practical thought, but it was my realization of the sexual imbalance in the church. There's far more women than there are men. And the divorcees were very aware of that. And I was there as a gay man researching Adventist Singles Ministries. And they kept telling me that I was the only really eligible man there. So that was my situation.
If you look at society as a whole and the issue, not just the Adventist church, how do sociologists feel about it? I mean, I've heard the other argument that that polygamy has a way of causing more war. You mentioned the reverse effect, but of causing more war because if there are a lot of men that aren't able to get a wife, and so they, high testosterone and all the rest, they just become more violent. But
I really haven't looked at that data, Robert. It would be a sociologist's normal response to look at a cultural situation within a society. And so we would describe how polygamy works or does not work in Africa, for example, or part of Africa. same way as we describe the changes in divorce here, divorce laws, and how they've changed as our culture has changed, and as our needs have changed, as our understanding of marriage has changed. That's so, and yes, we work out what works and what doesn't work. But it's according to the particular society and what works in that particular situation. I don't think it's possible to say in general polygamy has these possible positive things and these negative things any more than you can say the same about serial monogamy.
Okay, thanks.
Which reminds me, Ron, is I need to talk to you. I got a question this week, and somebody who was talking about a family member who had become polyamorous. That is, they had taken a second spouse into the family. It's still so fairly rare in Western society that it's hard to say what the results are, but it would be helpful to me if you could direct us in the direction of an answer to that. So maybe we can talk about that later. Art?
Yes, just a couple of comments, and they may have some questions embedded in them. I don't know, but you know, there's a lot of talk at times about how the explosive growth of the early church proves the central tenets of the faith. But it appears to me, as you look at how the early church really took off, was when it became somewhat syncretistic, learned to adapt and incorporate into the church and to present to possible converts that they could maintain a lot of their old ways and just call them Christian instead. And I wonder about when Adventism is presented to people of other cultures, if what we're really asking them to do is become not just become Adventists, but become Americans. Just don't think of applying for citizenship, but you really need to become Americans. I had this one other comment I wanted to make, and that is that what we've been discussing here is this real tension, and there's a lot of tensions in any thought, any type of thinking, you know, between grace and works, faith and works, those types of things. But we've been talking here today about how we need to be inclusive and welcome all people and love them. But we've been raised in and have brought to the world a teaching system or a thought system that says, no, we're different. We're exclusive. It isn't right to just welcome anybody in. You need to have the right thought of the state of the dead. You need to have the right thought, not just the right thought about the Sabbath, but the right practice of it, and any number of other things. So we deal with these tensions. And I think that's one of our real conundrums here.
The difference between an Adventist and a bad Adventist.
Yeah.
Art, I heard a pastor say one time, he said, "We Adventists aren't for everybody. We're like the Marines. We want a few good men." Ariane?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm really enjoying the presentation. I actually read all 11 pages of the manuscript last night because I was just fascinated by the missteps along the way. And what I wanted to know as I reflect on the article that I recently wrote for Adventist Today as we look at ministry, and one of the proposals that I was making is that we should assess a community, look at their culture, look at what their actual needs are, and let that define how we reach out to them. And I think that's one of the key things that has been missing time and again as we go into different communities, where we have a standard that is set in some other area, some other jurisdiction, some other country, possibly another continent. And we take that into a community, present it, and then expect that people will then conform. So my question is, how likely do you think it would be that as a church, we do the research, we meet the people, we find out why is it that polygamy works in this society and has been a part of the society for so long? Why is it that these people use this kind of music when they're celebrating? Why do they eat these foods when they're celebrating? As you mentioned, goats, Loren, that's something very big in Jamaica. There isn't a wedding or a birthday or a funeral, whatever it is, without some goats, you know? So do you think it's likely that we can get to that point as a church where we do that kind of needs assessment before trying to minister?
Well, we do have some, there's been, starting with Gottfried Oosterwald, our missions people at Andrews started to think about the context that the missionaries were going into and started teaching that in the 80s and onwards. The trouble is this was happening just as the flow of missionaries was flowing off. And the ones, when we had large numbers of missionaries go, they were not trained in this sort of thing, and they tended to take American culture with them and to insist on American culture. It's interesting, I found it interesting that when I went to different, quote, mission fields, as they've been known, to find that now that there was local leadership there, the local leadership held very closely to these things that were taught them by the missionaries, which were not part of their culture at all. You know, I remember, for example, going to the headquarters church in Nairobi the Sabbath before Christmas. I think it was the day before Christmas, actually. And it just happened to be the Adventist turn where the sermon was going to be broadcast on the Sunday, of course, as the church telecast of a church service. And the pastor made of his sermon to be broadcast on Christmas Day. The reason why Adventists do not keep Christmas. And I was just so embarrassed. And interestingly, the next day there was a Christmas party there on that campus among the missionaries. So the Americans had changed, but the Kenyans hadn't.
Well, our time is about up. And Ron, I want to thank you. And I hope you'll forgive me for reading your piece for you.
You saved me a lot of voice.
Well, I was afraid that by the time you finished the piece and got to the questions, you wouldn't have a voice at all anymore.
That was, I think, a possibility, yes.
And so that's why I interrupted you and took over. And when we edit the piece, I'll edit out some of the transition part there. And I love this whole discussion. I don't always put up the whole discussion, but I hope nobody here minds if I put up the discussion with them in it. If you do, let me know, because your questions and your comments were so good. I think most people will probably stick to mostly to the presentation, but I thought the questions were really good. Ayanda, I'm going to give you the last word, my friend. I'm so glad to have you back, and I'm so glad that you're well. Go ahead.
Oh, yes. We are well, although we are still fighting this. I think on Sunday I'm going to go get my jab, so I should be okay. I don't know if you guys had a discussion on vaccines. But anyway, on Sunday, I'm going to, oh, that's tomorrow. I'll run and then go get my jab. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about polygamy, and this is not just polygamy with how the church behaves. It's the church, I think Sherry Ann just mentioned this, that the church sometimes refuses to regard the people on the ground. It has this top-down approach, and the top-down approach sometimes hurts the lived experiences of the people. For the most part, I've been quiet and just listening to the conversation because I started thinking and saying, well, there's a lot of things that are happening on the ground that might be legally sound with regards to how the church has set up and theologically sound, but they're not just at the end of the day. You know, it might be legal, but it's not just. For instance, here in South Africa, apartheid was legal, but it was not just. Slavery was legal, but it was not just. And that goes with a lot of things that sometimes we end up finding in the church manual, that some things may be legal, but they're not just. And I hope, although I don't see it happening, I don't see our church ever changing the situation where it says, okay, the people on the ground or the church on the ground see what it does for the people so that we can make laws that are appropriate for you. Instead, it's the top-down approach. It says no polygamy. It offers no alternative. And just lastly, there's an example while I was still in the seminary in the Philippines, because there's no divorce, and then the guy that was baptized into the ministry, into the church, he was married in his 20s, but he was estranged with his wife. He went to live on the other side of the country and found another woman. They lived together. They were shacking up. And then when he joined the church, it found that he was married, but not with the woman he was with. And the laws in the Philippines does not allow divorce. Divorce is illegal. So the church was faced with the question that he wants to be baptized, but he's shacking up. And so it's one of those things. It was a big thing. I think the church had to leave some exceptions. I don't know if there's a Filipino here who would talk on that, but I'm still saying that I wish the church can see the laws of the country and work with the people on the ground so that at the end, it's not about what happens in somebody's bedroom, it's their relationship with God that eventually matters. Thank you very much.
Ayanda, before you go, type your email address into the chat for me, will you?
All right. Okay.
So that I know that. Matilda Fry is here. She's going to be teaching for us in 3 weeks. Matilda, I believe she's teaching. Matilda, can you describe what you'll be teaching on? So I know it's a topic having to do with the ecclesiology, or was it the Sabbath? No, it was the Sabbath.
Yes, hello. Yes, it is. It will be about the Sabbath. Thank you so much for mentioning that.
I'm looking forward to it. We have some really good teachers coming up, and Julius Nam is going to be here in September. Jim Walters is going to be coming back to teach at the end of August. I do have a couple of openings here that I'm going to need to try to fill in between there. And so I may turn to some of you to work on things with me. Thank you very much, everybody. I just really appreciate so many of you. And Ron, we've known each other for years and years. I met you at Mount Vernon Academy when you came for a presentation way back in 1986 or so, when you were traveling around the Bay Area. And we've been friends ever since. Do you want to say a word before we end?
So I wanted to add something to what Ayanda said. There's something, I'm not certain of the year, but I know that one of the times when the General Conference made a decision that was anti-polygamy, at the same session or the same annual council, it made a decision dealing with a situation in South America. In South America, for the longest time, divorce was illegal. And lots of people couldn't stand their spouses and just simply left them and shacked up with somebody else. And then that shacked up couple would become an Adventist. And they had no way of legalizing that marriage. And yet both of them were becoming Adventists. And the church's decision at that session was to say, we accept that. At the same session that it said no to baptizing the polygamously married men. And Russell Staples wrote about this. And in that article, he pointed out that at the same session, we were showing grace in one direction and not in another. And that's the way we can be.